U.S. Secretary of State puts his colleagues on the clock. Rex Tillerson says members must boost their defense budgets within 2 months' time. Michael Flynn wants immunity in exchange for testifying. Donald Trump's former national security advisor says there's a story to tell over the administration's alleged ties to Russia. And protests continue in Venezuela as the judiciary and legislative branches blend into one. Fears the president is in a power grab after the Supreme Court ruled it would take on the duties of the opposition-held assembly. Rex Tillerson initially said he'd skip the NATO summit, but the Secretary of State arrived in Brussels in the spotlight. Many members of the Security Alliance eager to find out where the Trump administration stands. Tillerson doing little to warm up to his colleagues when he said members must increase their defense spending. Ellen Gainsford has the story.
The U.S. Secretary of State came to the summit armed with an ultimatum, pressing the other NATO member nations to increase their defense budgets.
Three important areas we want to talk about. First is ensuring that NATO has all of the resources, financial and otherwise, that are necessary for NATO to fulfill its mission.
Of the 28 member nations, only 5 currently meet the target of 2% of GDP. The U.S. spends more on defense than all the others combined, 3.61% of GDP in 2016. Aiming to draw a line under the funding row, the NATO Secretary General backed the call for higher spending contributions, not to please Washington, but to counter new threats.
Increased defense spending across Europe and Canada is not just something we have to do to please the United States. It's not just about pleasing the United States. It is about investing in our own security, in the security of Europe.
But not all members appear to be on board with the plan.
2% would mean that Germany put 70 billion euros into the military. I don't know any politician in Germany who would claim that that is either reachable or desirable in our country.
During election campaigning, Trump suggested he might not come to the defense of allies who didn't share the burden more fairly, alarming countries that share borders with Russia. But Tillerson allayed fears, saying the US would uphold their NATO agreements. Toughening his tone towards Moscow, he denounced Russia's ongoing hostility and occupation of Ukraine.
And as you heard in that report, Tillerson saying the U.S. is committed to NATO. And for that reason, our Brussels correspondent Maeve McMahon told us that provided relief to the members of the alliance.
I think they were relieved that Rex Tillerson's actually showed up, because it was scheduled, in fact, for next week, this meeting, but he had other commitments, like the president of China was visiting Donald Trump, so he decided that he wouldn't be able to come, and therefore that meeting was rescheduled for today. And he did bring reassurances from the White House that the US still very much backs NATO and that it still remains the bedrock of transatlantic cooperation. And he also referred to Russian aggression, both violent and non-violent, and said that NATO was a very important tool to counter that. He also said for the United States at the moment, the #1 national threat to security is the fight against terrorism, and he called on all NATO allies to share the burden when it comes to this struggle, and as well that of cyber security. Now, this meeting today was in preparation for a much bigger summit that will take place here in Brussels on the 25th of May in the new HQ of NATO, where the US President Donald Trump himself will be here.
Maeve McMahon from Brussels. Now, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn is prepared to testify before Congress about alleged links between the Trump administration and Russia. In exchange, he wants immunity. 6 months ago on U.S. television, he said someone who receives immunity means they've probably committed a crime. Luke Schrago has more.
His lawyer says he has a story to tell. Ousted former U.S. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn has reportedly offered to testify about potential ties between U.S. President Donald Trump's campaign and Russia in return for immunity. It's certainly somewhat ironic given comments he made about former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton last year.
No individual too big to jail. That should include people like Hillary Clinton. I mean, 5 people around her have been given immunity, to include her former chief of staff. When you are given immunity, that means that you've probably committed a crime.
Flynn was a close advisor to Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential campaign. He was ousted from his post in the White House for misleading the Trump administration about discussions he had with the Russian ambassador to the U.S. before Trump's election victory. U.S. and UK security chiefs had allegedly already spoken of their concerns of Flynn's links with Russia before Trump's inauguration. The president waded into the affair on social media, saying that he agreed Mike Flynn should ask for immunity, in that the situation was a witch hunt, again blaming his favorite targets, the Democrats and the media. There are currently 4 congressional committees looking into links between the Trump administration and Russia. Focus has been put on Flynn's discussions with Russian officials, but also former Trump campaign director Paul Manafort and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, who is due to face Senate questioning over his relation with the Russian ambassador, as well as the head of the Russian Bank of Development.
And a decision that could end some of Donald Trump's legal woes, a federal judge ending legal battles that stretched 7 years and 2 class action lawsuits, ruling that Trump must pay $25 million. Nearly 4,000 students allege that his for-profit Trump University cheated them out of thousands of dollars of tuition through high-pressure sales techniques and false claims about what they would learn. One former student wanted to see Trump tried for racketeering charges and offer a formal apology. A day after approving the first new settlements in a quarter-century, Israel media reported that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu supposedly ordered a slowdown at the same cabinet meeting. This out of respect for Donald Trump. Meanwhile, the United Nations and Palestinian officials have described the new settlements as a threat to peace. Catherine Viette reports.
Keeping his word, the Israeli Prime Minister has just green-lighted the first new West Bank settlement in over 2 decades.
I made a promise that we would establish a new settlement. I think I made the first commitment in December, and we will keep it today.
The promise was made to residents of Amona, an illegal outpost that was cleared last month after the Israeli Supreme Court ruled it had been built on private Palestinian land. Palestinian officials were quick to condemn the decision.
The declaration of the Israeli government to build a new settlement instead of Amona is a very dangerous step. This means that Netanyahu has only one policy: to continue settlements, to expand settlements, to kill the possibility of two-state solution through settlement building. This is a very dangerous development, and it requires immediate international pressure on Israel.
The UN, too, expressed its outrage.
The Secretary General has consistently stressed that there is no plan B for Israelis and Palestinians to live together in peace and security. He condemns all unilateral actions that, like the present one, threaten peace and undermine the two-state solution.
Settlement construction in the West Bank and East Jerusalem has long been a source of tension between Israel and the Palestinians. More than 600,000 Israelis live in about 140 settlements built since the 1967 war on land the Palestinians want for a future state. The international community considers the settlements illegal and a major obstacle to the peace process, something Israel disputes.
2 days after Britain formally began the process to leave the EU, Scotland wants its own referendum, but this to remain in the bloc. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon wrote a letter to the UK's Prime Minister saying her people have a right to choose their future. While Britain as a whole voted to leave the EU last year, Scotland voted to remain. London has been reticent to grant an independence vote since the last one was only 3 years ago. In 2014, 55% of Scots chose to stay a part of Britain, but Sturgeon says the circumstances have since changed. And the agenda of upcoming talks for the UK to leave the EU are starting to take shape. While Britain is focusing on securing a beneficial free trade deal, Brussels is prioritizing the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and British nationals living in the bloc. As Josh Vardy reports, the talks are expected to be tough.
The Brexit process begins. In Malta, European Council President Donald Tusk laid out the EU's negotiating table. He said the bloc's priorities would be to ensure the futures of the 3 million EU nationals living in the UK and the 1 million UK nationals living in EU countries, as well as solving the question of the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.